Hi, welcome to the Business Growth Journey podcast with me, Nick Termini. Today, we've got an incredible guest and we're going to dive into a lot of awesome stuff. But first, let me introduce Ricky Bellinger. Ricky, what's up, man? Welcome to the show.
What's going on, Nick? Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fired up, man. I'm excited to have you on. So, Ricky, first, as we're getting rocking and rolling, how have we met?
Yeah, so I think we got connected through Sam Jones. Shout out Sam,
Sam Jones,
mutual
baby.
friend and banker. So great guy, and couldn't recommend him enough.
Absolutely. He's a sharp guy and well-versed in the M&A space as well. So, Ricky, to get started and kind of walk through what the podcast is going to look like, we first want to get to know you. Could you tell us about where you grew up, where you went to school, what kind of activities you did, that type of stuff?
Yeah, I grew up in Lawrence, Kansas, with my parents and my little brother. Went to LHS, played sports, football, baseball, that good stuff. But knew from an earlier age that was only going to carry me really through, high school. And at that point, it was, time to get serious about school and what I was going to pursue next. And so ended up going to KU after that and studying mechanical engineering for my undergrad.
What led you to mechanical engineering?
It was kind of a process of elimination. I thought engineering sounded good and mechanical engineering was the one that fit most naturally. I knew it wasn't going to be chemical or electrical or computer engineering. So just kind of narrowed it down to mechanical, and that's what we went after.
Okay, awesome. And but before we get into college, what were some of the things that you learned from playing sports and just different activities you're in that were foundational for you to, grow to where you are now?
Yeah, I think it's just a lot of the normal stuff, Nick. Teamwork, hard work, perseverance, continuing to show up day after day and put in the work even when you don't want to. Just the ability to grind it out. So,
Yep.
yeah, I mean, I think that the general stuff that most people get from sports, and so also, just how you compete with people that maybe have the natural talent advantage on you, and just again, the leg up that you get from just showing up and putting in the hard work, even when maybe you aren't the most talented at different things.
Awesome. So then you go to KU, and what was it like going to college where you grew up in your hometown?
Yeah, so I actually, for a long time, told myself that I wasn't going to go to KU for that reason, Nick. I really wanted to make college its own thing and not just
Yeah.
a continuation of high school. And so
Yep.
just made it an effort to get out and make new friends and not fall back on, hanging out with the friends that I had that were still around Lawrence because it was easy to do that. So just try to get involved in a bunch of new different things and make friends that, like I said, were from different areas that were new to Lawrence. And then I could always, as the townie, have the recommendation for the spot to go or the thing to do, but I didn't want that to be the only thing that I did in school.
I was gonna say you're like the Lawrence tour guide for all the newbies, man.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I tried to get away from that as quickly as I could, but you can only escape that so much. They know. So when people want a recommendation, you're the person they come to.
Where's Ricky? I don't know where to get a good panini.
Yeah. Where do you more like, where can we buy beer? What bar can we get into? And maybe, where's a good spot for a burger or pizza? But mostly the first two in those early
So
years
you
of
already got the
college.
groundwork laid and all the relationships built. It's beautiful.
Exactly.
Awesome. And so when you got into mechanical engineering, what were some of the things you gravitated to as you started to look at that as how you're going to get your degree and then move on?
It's funny, Nick. I think it's a lot of math and physics and things that came more natural to me in the way that my brain works. After a few years in engineering, I think the thing that I really figured out was that I wasn't going to be an engineer for my career. But at that point, nothing else jumped out at me as the correct path. And so I finished my degree and worked on just getting out of school with a degree that I thought, communicated the ability to do those analytical things. And my perspective was a degree in mechanical engineering wasn't gonna close a lot of doors. So for me, it was just about keeping my options open, getting the degree, and then figuring out when I graduated what it was that I really wanted to do career wise. And spoiler, I still haven't figured that out. So as I think most people are. So it's it was a good degree to get. It helped as I went on and went back to school and got other degrees and such. I think that having that engineering degree is an easy proof point for a lot of people that you can do the math, that you can do some of the analytical stuff. And so I never found that it hurt me to have that engineering degree kind of at the foundation.
What are some of the projects that you worked on? Like what kind of things were you diving into? I have a marketing degree, so the engineering degrees I find to be fascinating yet very foreign to me, right? Like, so what were some of the things you worked on?
Yeah, eh, there was a lot of different, I wouldn't say there was big projects per se. You take a bunch of different classes, and classes might have different projects. For the bigger projects, I would actually say I was part of a leadership program that was within the School of Engineering where we got to do some cool things like host different big events for the School of Engineering, or we created a study abroad program over winter break for the engineering students because we identified, studying abroad was a challenge as an engineer with such a rigid curriculum, and we wanted students within the school to be able to do that. So we stood that up. And so I'd say some of the more fulfilling projects were actually some of those more leadership, broad based projects that I was able to do rather than, trying to go in and design and fundamental element analysis, whether or not LeBron James was going to break our backboard if we had it designed the way that we did, and, goofy things like that.
Wait, was that a project? Like how did
That
Shaq
was a project. We had to come
Here
up
we
with our own
go.
projects. It was a project, yes.
How did Shaq change the way backboards are?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't tell you. I'm pretty sure our
The
backboard broke, so
the guy broke like 10 goals when he first entered the NBA. So I'm sure that led to some serious engineering opportunities within.
absolutely, absolutely, and this one, I think we gotta come up with our own project, so we needed something goofy, and I think that's what we ended up settling on.
That's a strong one. Okay, and then as you built out, the study abroad problem or program as part of the leadership team, what are some of the things you learned from that? Like how do you kind of figure out how to build that?
Yeah, so we worked with a professor in the School of Business, and it was really just about trying to take a step back, and it was our senior capstone project for that program that I was in, and so we talked about different problems that engineering students face, and the inability to study abroad was the one that we ultimately honed in on. And so it wasn't, we didn't start down the path saying, let's create this study abroad program over winter break. It was, we looked at that broad set of problems that students had in the School of Engineering and narrowed down on the study abroad problem as one we wanted to try and come up with a solution for. And so once we did that, it was, what different avenues exist for us to get something done. Summer is such a critical time during engineering because of the internships that they expect you to have and that you really
Yeah.
need to have on your resume to get the job you want when you graduate. So that's off the table. The semesters, there's such a rigid curriculum that if you miss a semester in the engineering curriculum, you basically get set back an entire year, which, at the time, really wanting to graduate in 4 years sounds awful. Now, the idea of taking 5 or 6 years, taking extra years in college sounds pretty great now.
I
But
did
at the,
5.
see, you did it right.
Victory lap, man.
Exactly. So we were really just looking for ways that we could tackle the problem. And so we identified winter break as a time that we could do it. We partnered up with a professor that was in the School of Business and went to India for a couple weeks to try and create some relationships with different schools and businesses that we could partner with there to then actually set up the curriculum for this winter break problem or winter break study abroad. And the interesting thing about India in that regard is they just face such a different set of engineering problems than we do in the US. You're talking about a place in the US where we have a lot of infrastructure developed and then the population is spread across the top of it versus in India, things like you're trying to create a high speed rail system to allow people to travel and commute, and you don't have areas where there aren't already people living. So, how do you go back into heavily populated areas and try and build rail systems and stuff like that? So, just a really different set of problems and challenges. And so really unique to go look at and have conversations about those problems and how they're trying to tackle them versus what we see here in the US.
How did that program and like some of the challenges you're talking about open your brain up?
Yeah, I mean, again, just them being so different, Nick. You think that you see how we do things in one area of the world, and it becomes this kind of framework that you follow to solve a problem. and then you go somewhere else and you realize that, the foundation for the problem that you're trying to solve is completely different, and the old frameworks that you thought worked,
Yep.
you just have to throw them out the window and start from scratch. And so it was eye opening, just to this idea that you could follow these, like I said, natural frameworks that we have in place in the US, these natural processes you have to go through and meet the different codes and criterias. And then you go there and it's like, this is completely out the window. We can't go build this, foundation for this train because there isn't the room for it. You're talking about having to claim people's homes and businesses and other things versus, there just not being anything like that. And so there just wasn't space, in India to do that. And so having to figure out new ways to tackle problems, and having to figure out, foundational kind of principles that you thought you could start any problem by knowing, at least I know A is one, B is two, and C is three, and all of a sudden that's out the window and you're starting from a complete new fact set. So yeah, it was just kind of mind opening to have to throw out the things that you think you know and start from scratch.
Man, what an incredible experience in college.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a lot of fun in college, and it was definitely eye-opening. Anytime you can travel and see how, different parts of the world live and you know, different problems that they face. I think it's great for perspective and remembering that what we know and what we're used to, we should be thankful for a lot of things, and that it's not the way that the rest of the world has it in terms of everything that we have here.
Man, what an incredible perspective to gain so early. That's got to be eye opening to kind of help change the way that you tackle problems, but also look ahead, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you always got to stop and say, the way that I see the world isn't the way that everyone else sees the world. And I think that the more that we can do that, the more valuable. I mean, it's obviously insanely valuable to be able to do that, especially now being in the business world and thinking about how we take care of our customers. It's valuable to have the perspective that I need to stop and think and put myself in someone else's shoes and think about how they experience our service, our product, our offering.
Yeah, you got to slow down and speed up, right? So when you look at, I mean, that's an incredible opportunity. Now that say we're at the point where college is winding down, you're looking at what you're going to do after you graduate in 4 years. What was next?
Yeah, so I knew I didn't want to do engineering. So I,
Valuable 4 years spent,
yeah,
man. Now you can
yeah,
check the
yeah,
box, know
I
what you
learned
don't want to do.
something. I learned something, right? So
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to have an opportunity to go to work for a company called Johnson Controls. They're a large HVAC controls equipment service manufacturer and provider. And so I went into a sales role in the construction industry, and called on some large accounts that we had, from universities to hospitals, to manufacturing plants, and sold large commercial HVAC equipment and controls, mostly on the comfort cooling side. So, think about your AC at your home that's keeping you cool right now, or an air handler that's turning over the air in an area where you want to make sure that air doesn't stagnate, or that it's been pushed through filters so people aren't passing germs to one another. But also on the, manufacturing side, where you'd have process cooling on, manufacturing lines that required some sort of chilling or cooling in the process. So across the spectrum, got to do all that. You layer on the controls piece. So, universities might be mindful of how they're, using blinds to raise and lower to prevent sunlight from coming into a space, and then that heating the space and increasing the cooling load that they need. And so all of that comes into play from an energy efficiency standpoint. And so it was just interesting, kind of the overlay of all those different systems, going in, calling on all those accounts, and building up that, really like that account sales muscle, of how do we go in and really kind of embed ourselves and become partners with these accounts and understand their budget cycles and their needs from, a facility standpoint, from a labor standpoint. We'd sell service contracts, so providing them boots on the ground to help maintain and service their facilities if they were short staffed. And so just kind of holistically trying to serve these customers from our offering was a great experience, and learned a lot, right out of school, as someone green and eager and, willing to put in the effort and have a good attitude, but very green in terms of knowledge. It was great. And I learned a ton. We did that for 4, maybe 5 years before going back to school again.
So when you were at Johnson Controls, like what in the very beginning, like, hey, here's your list, go get them. Like what was it like starting out, and like what was your process like? Either just finding new accounts, right? Like what if you were coming from an engineering degree, starting out in a selling role is kind of a different animal, right? Like it's highly technical, but what was it like for you to walk in somewhere or make the first call or just begin the sales process for a new prospect?
Yeah, so fortunately, I started with a short list of places
Yeah.
to call on that maybe had some more stuff installed. It wouldn't be the full spectrum, but maybe they had one thing installed. And so that was a good way to get your foot in the door and go in there and develop that relationship and try and kind of, increase the share of
Get
wallet that we
wider.
had for the facility. Exactly. But other places it was, I was on the post construction side. So we had a new construction team that was out bidding, projects that were being constructed, and they really called on the contractors, the engineers, and a little bit less so the actual owners that would occupy the facility. And so as those projects came to a close, if it was done correctly, you could work on kind of getting the handoff to come in on the back of those and make sure that we were continuing to service those new systems that we'd installed and use that as kind of a way to get your foot in the door and develop that relationship with the owner on the backside. Other than that, it was, especially as a new salesperson, like any leads that came in the door that didn't have someone that immediately claimed them that had seniority on me, it was, jumping at the opportunity to go chase that lead and just being eager and not acting like any lead was below me. There's probably plenty of leads that came in that were not great leads, but when you're when you're new and you're prospecting, like you got to kind of jump at any opportunity you get. So other than that, talking with the team about places that we didn't have any installation and maybe trying to go in and drop in and introduce yourself, but it's really hard when there's incumbents in places like that. And unless someone really gives you an opening by dropping the ball and you just happen to be in the right place at the right time, it's
Which
really
does
hard to
happen.
come in and get a full. Well, it does. But, as a new salesperson and really not knowing how to look for certain triggers that might cause opportunities and changeover in terms of accounts of people that are in their service in different facilities, it was really just showing up and hoping that the timing was good and hoping that the incumbent had dropped the ball. And that's not a good odds game to play, Nick.
Gotcha. And what would your schedule look like at this time of year when it's 105 degrees out?
Yeah, so the heat definitely drove some things breaking, but it was really I don't recall there being a whole lot of seasonality, Nick. I don't recall there being, huge spikes in the summer when there was a need for cooling or huge spikes in the winter when there was a need for heating. Some things would definitely break, but if you were doing it correctly, you were providing a lot of the preventative services as we headed into heating season or into cooling season, and that would actually front run a lot of the problems that you might have otherwise. So done correctly, you're not seeing crazy seasonal swings. It's a little smoother.
So there's a lot of proactive selling is what I'm hearing?
If done correctly, yes. If done correct, and
Gotcha.
I say if done correctly because I certainly was not a phenomenal salesperson, Nick. I can tell you how it should have been done. I can't tell you exactly how I did it. So take it with a grain of salt.
So with this being your first job after graduating from KU, what are some of the things you've learned that have helped carry you forward to where you are today?
Yeah, I think that there's just as you really think about building out a sales pipeline, and actually being structured in the way that you think about prospecting an opportunity and following up on it. And then the project management side, when I would sell some large project, the continuing to work with the owner, working with our team and the project manager on our side and the guys that would actually be out executing it and just staying on top of that and kind of like serving as the liaison between our team and the owner. And if you correctly embedded yourself in that process, then you were set up well to on the back end when the project actually completed to then roll that right into the continued service of everything else you're already doing for the customer. Or if it was a new customer, developing the right cadence to be in there helping maintain the facility on the back end. And there's a lot of, parts of that that look very similar to the deal process now. Look similar to the deal process at JP Morgan, Advantage, and now kind of prospecting M&A leads and then working on, actually going from the prospecting phase through the acquisition and integration phase. There's a lot of things that mirror process wise between those two things.
People that are listening, that was called a teaser. So as we're moving forward, Ricky, so what's next after Johnson Controls?
Yeah, so I went back and I got my MBA, went to Cornell. I spent 2 years in Ithaca, New York with my wife. We had just gotten married, moved to Ithaca together, and so spent 2 years at Cornell doing the MBA thing. Spent the summer between interning at JP Morgan and their industrials investment banking group, diversified industries, or DI is what they call it, and then was fortunate enough to come back the second year with an offer in hand to return full time to JP Morgan when I graduated. So did that for a couple of years. That was a great experience. I don't know if you want to double click into anything there, Nick,
Yeah,
but
I do.
then, okay. Well,
So
I'll probably
so
pause there.
so when you look at, you got married, you and your wife moved to Ithaca, New York after doing your undergrad in your hometown. What was that like, culturally, finding your grocery store, growing together as a new married couple, and diving into a pretty serious curriculum too.
Yeah, it was definitely a fun adventure to undergo as a newly married couple
Yeah.
together. You take away everybody that you know, all of your friends and family, even just your daily habits and schedule. You talk about the grocery store, like everything was brand new. So it
Everything.
was it was just a lot of fun to explore together. And I think definitely, made us closer, made our marriage stronger right out of the gate. Just being the one other person that that you're familiar with, that you have to lean on, and we had a blast with it, and we made a ton of new friends. My wife says that she got a social MBA, which I
Yeah.
think is probably true. But you know, I told myself when I went to KU for undergrad, not wanting it to be a continuation of high school, that if I went back to school, that I would get away for the second bite at the apple. And so when
Yep.
we went to back to grad school, or when I was thinking about going back to grad school, I did not look at anywhere close to home, which is Lawrence. And so, ended up picking Cornell, really liked Ithaca, really liked the way that their program was structured. They had a great investment banking program. And when you thought about evaluating Cornell versus somewhere that was in a major city, so the easy ones to point to that were nearby were Columbia or NYU. Just a very different feel from a student standpoint of being in Ithaca, where you're really not surrounded by anything but your classmates in the school, and you just naturally hang out together because there aren't a gazillion other options, like if you're in New York City. And then looking at those other programs that are in those major cities where the students have a ton of things to go do, but I don't think they naturally end up being as close with one another. There was just a lot of things that jumped out to me about Cornell and about going to school there versus other places that made it kind of a natural fit. And while I wanted to get away from Lawrence, Ithaca actually reminds me a lot of Lawrence. So it was a great place to go to school. My wife would have wished it was a little warmer, but other than that, it was great.
So how did the opportunity of you being part of the leadership program and, you know, heading to India kind of open your eyes to being prepared to move away?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, going to India, you just have your eyes open that things are, you know, you got to adapt at whatever kind of environment you're dropped into. And I would, Ithaca's a far cry from India. I mean,
Yeah.
but still, it's just you get your head on your shoulders. You set up your home base. I like I said, my wife and I always had each other to fall back on. And then it's just getting out and exploring and finding kind of the natural core things that you need: the grocery store, any kind of place to get your car worked on, just the basics. And so it was, again, it was just an adventure. We got there, we explored, we found our kind of key places, we made our kind of key friend group, and then you go from there.
So I'm with you on. So I moved away right after college, and lived in Georgia for 6 months, Detroit for a month, and then landed in Virginia Beach as my sales territory for my first job out of college. And I was there about 4 years, but I was alone. I was flying solo, 6 states away from anybody I knew or whatever it is. And I can imagine it's just a totally different experience with your, wife and building your new life together, where it's an opportunity where it's, us together figuring it all out versus doing it alone's a wild ride, man.
I'm sure.
We'll leave it at that. But what an incredible opportunity. So as you got into grad school, what kind of classes were you taking, and what were you gearing up to learn to grow to the next phase?
Yeah. So the way that the MBA program worked, at least at Johnson, the Johnson School of Management is the business school at Cornell. And so you have your standard business classes, everything from marketing and ops to accounting and finance. But the way that Cornell runs their program is that they have what they call an immersion that sits on top of your general classes the second semester of your first year that you're in school. And really, the whole point of that immersion is to prepare you to be successful during your summer internship. Because if you're successful in your summer internship, you come back to school the second year with an offer in hand, you've already placed, everything is good. And so that immersion is basically a practicum that sits on top of your normal class set. It's specific to what you're recruiting for. And so I was in the investment banking immersion. And basically, you're going through and you're doing these different cases from week to week that have to do with the work that you're going to be doing when you get into the seat. And so that is an awesome program led by an awesome individual who spent many years banking and has worked his way up the leadership at the business school now. But that in particular, I think leads Johnson to convert at a much higher rate on their summer internships in investment
Yeah.
banking than other schools. And so again, when evaluating where to go to school and settling on investment banking as the path to pursue, that is really kind of what made Johnson a natural fit for that. And it was, you do your normal classes and then you'd go and you'd put together these crazy cases and go and present them in front of that professor and different alumni that would come back as guests and get just grilled. I remember being very nervous that my group would be selected every week when we go in there, and it was a huge sigh of relief when you weren't selected and you got to
You
watch
didn't
someone else
know?
go.
So you had it prepared, and then you go in, you don't know if it's your
You don't
day or
know who's
not.
going to get selected. That's correct. Yeah. So,
So
I
you just
mean,
got to be locked and loaded, ready to roll.
every week you have to be prepared like you're going to be the one picked. Yeah. So they
So a
structure it
little
that way for a
tension in the
reason.
cord.
Oh yeah, it works. You go in there puckered, man.
Yeah, 100%. So then you leave and you're like, it wasn't us today. Damn, we got to do it again next week.
Yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, it does a great job of preparing you for when you hit the desk in the real world. And so now you're in New York, you're in the thick of it, you're working on real projects and everything's it's so fast. Everything's flying around you and you hit the ground until you get your bearings. And so to have that tension that, is driving you and is, it makes you work a little harder when you're not sure if it's going to be you that gets picked, because heaven forbid it is you that gets picked. Like, the product that you put together better be top notch. And so, and you better be ready to speak to it. That's the other thing is, when you get called up there in front of the class and it's you and the three other people in your group presenting, no one can hide. So, if it was one of those group projects where three people did all the work and one person just kind of, skid by on the backs of everyone else, like, that person is going to become exposed immediately when you
Yep.
get up there and start getting grilled. So it was great. Just to get those reps in and get reps in that at the time, it's funny, they felt really, critical. They felt really like, heaven forbid we drop the ball on this or look like idiots. And then you get in the real world and realize that it was really nothing from a stress standpoint versus doing the actual work. But it's a great way to, start to dip your toes in the water, start to boil the frog in terms of getting you ready to do the real work and
Frog's
really be in the
boiling, man.
seat.
I like it.
So, yeah.
And what helped you get set your sights on investment banking?
You know, I I don't think I even really knew what investment banking was when I first started looking in
Yeah.
the MBA path. But when I went and visited and talked to the different people that were pursuing different things, there is definitely a stigma around the people pursuing investment banking. And I went and talked to some of them and I was like, these are my people. They're just, it's very hard charging. I won't say aggressive, but like, there has to be a real ownership over the product and the outcome. And it has to be perfect, and you have to be really analytically minded. You have to be really driven. You have to be really on top of things. The project management piece is really key because when you get in the seat, you have all these different work streams coming at you and even different deliverables within the same kind of project. And so you really have to be able to manage all of those moving parts, understand how all the numbers tie together, and then the numbers and the product have to be perfect. So, a lot of time spent in PowerPoint cleaning up logos or text or, stuff that I would prefer to not spend any time doing ever again, but like a real attention to detail because, a lot of, there'd be people that would argue with me when I say this, but a lot of investment banking is really a commoditized product. It's a commoditized service. You're going to have some different MDs at the very top that deliver some differential insights. But beyond that, some of the lesser stuff, it's really all about the quality of the work that you do. And so, do you care enough not to have that hanging period or, that one number that's out of place that you missed or the logos that are misaligned. And so it really drives home that attention to detail that serves me, it does not serve me at all at this point in my career. So I really have to try and put some of that type A, aside and forget about it. And when I'm working on things now, I remind myself that, it doesn't have to be, we don't need to spend hours formatting a set of slides. It really helps no one. I'm the only one that cares.
So what was it like? So I remember in my career there was a team that I was on, and there was, I think there were 10 of us, and we sold business services, and we had the opportunity to go around the country and train with third party companies where we would sell their marketing, even like lease negotiations or insurance negotiation, team building, business coaching, all that type of stuff. And once I walked into the room on this team, it felt like the place I'd been looking for my whole life, right? Like where there's just a natural energy where we all clicked and everybody kind of had the same will to win and figure it out. What did it mean to you? Like you said you met your people, right? Like I remember the moment walking in and I'm like, this is explosive. This is dynamic, baby. Let's go. Like what was that like for you when you were in a room and kind of felt that energy?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice you're trying to figure out where you're going to fit in. And when you go in, you're like, these are my people. These are the people that I resonate with. These are the
Yeah,
people that are
it's
going to work
wild,
the
right?
same way. It's funny because a lot of the kind of work style that I had been used to in the construction world, I saw that there, like people being very direct, very blunt. Now, maybe a little bit less of the colorful language from the
Yeah.
construction world because this is about as white collar as it gets from a work standpoint. But just people that are very driven, where, failing to meet the deliverable or commitment is just completely unacceptable.
It
And
doesn't
where
even cross your mind, right? Like I don't even understand that.
yeah, it's how are we going to get this done? Not can we get this done?
When will it be done?
Yes. And then just the expectation that the work output and product was going to be perfect. And so there was never any question about, where people were at, what they were thinking. Like people just told you.
Get it done.
You might not like it. You might not feel good in the moment if you had to receive some harsh feedback, but it's
Yeah.
just one of those where there was so many parallels in terms of what I saw in terms of communication style and work process and expectations that it felt like kind of a very different in terms of going from construction to financial, but the work product might have changed, but the process and the communication style was very similar. And so that felt natural.
The feedback I always hated the most when I was in the corporate world is keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah. That doesn't help anybody.
You got to tear it down, man. Let's keep getting better. So as you're winding up your time at Cornell, which sounds tremendous experiences and meeting your tribe, right? What what was next? You mentioned going to New York and JP Morgan as a newlywed, maybe not as new, but still pretty new in the game, right? Pretty crazy from going from Lawrence to Ithaca to now New York City was a whole lot of concrete.
Yeah, yeah, my wife and I moved to New York kind of in the middle of COVID. So
Cool.
I
Yeah.
remember we thought we got a screaming deal on our apartment because everybody was moving out of the city and there was all kinds of apartments open and
Get your pick of the litter, man.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny perspective-wise what a screaming deal looks like in New York versus, I think that's still significantly more than my mortgage payment now. So, and that was I think when we left, the place that we were renting went up another like 20 or 30% in terms of monthly rent after we left. So it was nice that things were depressed when we moved in during COVID, but it was also an eerie time to move into the city. You'd go in and there was
Eerie
nothing
time
open.
in general.
Yeah, there was nothing else. You couldn't go down to a coffee shop and sit down there and work. And so I remember the first couple weeks we were in New York while we were waiting to get our Wi-Fi set up, we were bored out of our minds because we had no Wi-Fi in our apartment. You couldn't go anywhere and sit down and connect to Wi-Fi because everything was closed. So we just sat there and, read a book or two and people watched out the window and, found ways to fill the time. But, it very much was, Ithaca was like Lawrence in that there's plenty of green space and you might be in the city, but like the city is just not that big, 100,000 people into New York where, like you said, everything is concrete. And now to take the dog out to use the bathroom is, middle of the night, the dog needs to go, you're getting dressed and taking it down an elevator to take it outside to use the bathroom, and just a very different experience in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah, night and day. So what did your role look like as you got rock and rolling at JP Morgan, and like what were some of the high level things that you were doing?
Yeah, so I came in as an MBA associate. So the way the group is structured, you have your analysts at the bottom, then you have your associates, VPs. Everywhere does it a little bit different. We went VP, ED, MD, which is, associate vice president, executive director, managing director. And so there were, the people that came straight out undergrad in the group came in as analysts. If they'd stuck around a couple of years and were progressing in the group, they'd be promoted to associate. And so the people that had come in and worked their way up naturally to associate had already been in the role for, 3 or 4 years. You come in as an MBA associate, super green, and, little things like me trying to use Excel relative to even the analysts that had been there for a little while. It was, they take pity on you. They watch you work and they're like, yeah, how about you step aside and let me sit down at the keyboard and I'll do this real quick versus us all sitting here for an hour while you try and figure this out. So came in and basically early on they would stick you onto a project team like you were just kind of an extra in a group, and you would try to help out anywhere that you could. Mainly just try and not screw anything up as you kind of found your footing. But as time progressed as an associate, you kind of run a lot of the actual execution of a process. So you might work with an analyst or two analysts that are underneath you, or a greener associate. You might work with a team in India. You might be the one that coordinates or communicates with different teams within the bank if you're pulling in other functions. And so you play a lot of project manager. The VP does to an extent as well, but that's really where, I touched on it earlier, that project management skill felt very relevant to continue to build off of in that time as an investment banker.
So what, and if just real high level, could you kind of talk about what investment bankers do?
Yeah. So investment bankers are going to buy and sell companies. I say companies, but that could be divisions. You could carve out a division, or it could be an asset. You could have in the industrials world, you could have a company that owns a mine and they're going to sell that asset. Or it also goes into the capital markets side. So it could be that we need to go raise money to do some project. And so we're going to issue debt, or we're going to sell equity ownership in our company to raise additional funds. It could be looking at how somebody's trading in the market and saying, why does this company trade differently to their peers, and providing that sort of advice and input to the C-suite of a company. I think that hits on a lot of it. There's a bunch of other nuances and things, but I
Yeah.
think that probably captures the vast majority.
What are some of the main metrics that you would look at for any type of deal? What would you go in and start with?
Yeah, I mean, it completely depends on the type of the deal that you're doing, Nick, but in the acquisition world, everybody's always going to look at accretion, dilution. So accretion, like ACDIL is basically if I go buy this company and depending on how I pay for it, does the earning per share, the EPS of my company go up or go down post close? And so everybody always wants their deals to be accretive because as a shareholder, you want to know that it's creating value for you.
Mhm.
So
And so how would you know if that would go up or down?
whole lot of mash. Yeah. So, again, this is where you fall into the whole Excel, piece of things. And there's a whole lot of math going into things. And, that could change. We would update math at the end of the day when the market's closed, because that's when you might have some period of time when share prices were locked in. But that could move on you every day depending on how stocks traded in the market and where share prices closed. You know, it might be a little bit more stable if you're using cash or if you're issuing debt, depending on where you think your debt would issue at. But it's part of the reason that there's so much work that goes into investment banking is like you're chasing this ever moving target.
Okay, and so as you're wrapping up your time at JP Morgan and being in New York, what was next?
Yeah. So my wife and I decided we wanted to get a little bit closer to home, maybe have slightly better hours. And I touched on it being a lot of work, and it was.
Yeah.
But it was also an amazing, couple year, you know, trial by fire to step into the finance world away from what I was doing previously. And I, feel like I learned several years worth of, I got several years worth of work experience and learned, accordingly in the finance world from that. But we were ready to do something that was a little more conducive to us having a family, us being a little closer to home. And so, was fortunate enough to find a role with Vantage Partners in Kansas City. So came back and went to work for a family office where we were looking to deploy capital to go buy businesses now that, businesses that I would have been selling, although on a much smaller scale when I was at JP Morgan. And so we had a portfolio of companies at Vantage. They had a large multi-unit portfolio, for instance, where they had hundreds of Taco Bells, Dunkin' Donuts, kind of dispersed businesses like that, as well as different business services businesses that I was able to work with the team to help buy, acquire, operate, and also being a family office. I think the closest parallel that people are going to be familiar with is private equity. But being a family office, you don't have the same, you know, real guardrails around exit timing and investment horizon. You can be a little bit longer holder, a little bit more permanent equity style investing when you're in a family office. So less focus on how do we get in, immediately start thinking about getting out, and more focus on how do we buy good businesses that we're happy to hold indefinitely, and just kind of see where things take us.
So you mentioned, your time at JP Morgan was larger deals versus a family office was smaller. What are some of the differences, and like what what did you learn from one to the next?
Yeah, well, on the larger deal universe, you're just always going to have really buttoned up, well put together, gap compliant financials. And you really, you kind of trust that the numbers that you're seeing are correct. And then you can go run all your analysis on those versus as you start to move smaller, there can be a lot more variability in terms of the leadership teams and those smaller businesses, but also like, the numbers probably aren't gap compliant. Sometimes the numbers just aren't right, period, that you see. And so you have to really question even just those foundational inputs versus just saying, like, hey, the inputs are good. We trust these. Now go run the analysis on them. And so it becomes less just trust the numbers and run the math and more like, does all of this make sense holistically? Like taking a step back and taking a broader perspective. If we look at, you know, whatever the volume is for this business that we're looking at, and we look at the sales number, all of a sudden, does that average ticket make sense for that business? Or is there something funky going on here? And you have to be able to take a step back and say, I understand how all these parts move together and how they're interconnected. And so that means if we pull this one lever, this other lever has to move, maybe the same way, maybe the opposite way. And does that inverse movement make sense? And so you just have to start to be able to sense check things like that. And so the diligence looks a little bit different. At JP Morgan, it was we pull in these gap compliant financials, we pull in all their contracts. People were doing a lot broader macro type diligence versus Advantage. It was a lot more like, are these numbers that we're seeing for this business actually correct for this business? Does this make sense? And so, yeah, it's just as you go kind of as you move down the size stratosphere, like it changes a little bit of you can't trust some of the inputs like you could on the larger scale.
See, you've got to turn into a detective to make sure is what we're looking at correct.
Exactly.
And then what story is it telling, right?
Yeah, yeah, and does it all make sense when we talk to the leadership and they're telling us, "Hey, this one key guy was out sick for these 2 weeks," and we see a dip in the numbers, like, maybe that's believable, At JP Morgan, if you had one guy that was out sick for your business and that's causing a noticeable change in the numbers, that would be a huge red flag, just given the scale of those companies.
Okay. Well, this is tremendous experience because you're able to see all different types of how companies are run, what moves the needle, what doesn't, right?
Yeah, yeah, and you start to appreciate, you know at the large scale, it's a lot of the business school principles of, Porter's five forces and all that good stuff. And at the smaller end of the spectrum, like that stuff still matters. But you also can see you kind of end up with these leaders that are like hero leaders that can really move the needle of the business.
Yeah.
And so at the Vantage end of the spectrum, it's really like part of my view was we just got to find the best leaders to bet on. Like I would almost rather find an excellent leader in an okay business than an okay leader in an excellent business, because especially at the smaller end of things, like they really move the needle and you can see their impact more so than when you get so big. You're going to have much more polished leaders in those Fortune 500 companies, but one person doesn't move the needle necessarily unless they're at the very top, like you'll see in a smaller business.
So at what point did you start to get the itch to start your own company?
Yeah, I mean, Advantage, I would see some of the leaders and owners of some of these businesses that we were evaluating, and they had done incredible things and built incredible companies, but it's hard not to sit across the table from some of the and during some of those meetings and think, why couldn't that be me? Why couldn't I do this? I think that my perspective was a huge piece of it is just the willingness to take the jump. And if you're willing to make the leap, like that could be you. Now there's risk, there's downside risk associated with it, but I think that I just saw enough people, and of course, survivorship bias. I saw the people that things were going well for. I didn't see the people that they weren't.
Yeah.
But it's hard to sit there and see these people that had built something that was really valuable, and that they could be really proud of, and think, why couldn't I do the same thing?
So did that start to creep in your when did that creep in your mind?
Yeah, I don't know exactly when it started to creep into my mind, but I definitely saw it, and it had definitely been on my radar. Going all the way back to growing up in Lawrence, my grandfather had started an automotive shop that my father had been working for and then running for the past couple decades. And so there's always been some entrepreneurship around my family, and always a desire to, get into that at some point. And I think being Advantage just opened my eyes up to that being a possibility of something that I could do and pursue. And then also just starting to understand, how buyers looked at businesses of that scale and the valuation and the finance piece. And just, between seeing that and thinking, why couldn't this be me? Having that underlying desire to get into it, and then learning about the SBA as a financing vehicle that really kind of made it all possible. That was kind of the aha moment. So I guess roundabout way to answer your question, Nick, the day that one of my colleagues told me about the SBA, and I was like, that can't be real. There's no way that that's how that works.
Please elaborate.
The ability to put down 10% equity in a deal, and there's even ways to get around that further. But the ability to borrow 90% was not something that I had seen, in any of the funding vehicles that we'd used anywhere that I had been. So that 90% borrowing capacity with the SBA is incredibly attractive and makes purchasing a business, even as someone that doesn't bring a whole lot of capital to the table, possible in a way that I didn't realize was feasible.
So when did you start to look at, you know, shaping up Gen Auto, right? When did that go from, hey, I've got the itch, learning different tools you can use like the SBA to actually getting in motion and bringing Gen Auto to life?
Yeah, so I looked at a couple different manufacturing and business services businesses, at the same time as I started to really prep my father's shop for sale. And so to take a step back, Gen Auto kind of came to be when didn't love the offers that we're getting from my father's business and thought, at this valuation and this interest level, I'm a buyer of these assets, not a seller. And so why don't I go out and create this platform and start to buy these independent auto repair shops, use some of that kind of dispersed business model knowledge that I got in Advantage and apply it to this industry that I like for a number of reasons from an investment standpoint. And I can build this platform where we go out and buy these long-standing, long-established independent auto repair shops that have a technician base that's a solid set of techs, have a customer base that's been coming there forever and is loyal and doesn't want to have to go search for another shop. And we can literally allow these owners to transition into retirement while continuing the business operation for both of those other parties that I just mentioned. And it kind of feels like a win for everybody. So started to form the idea of that. It's easy enough to set up the transaction with my father's business, considering I was the one selling it. So, set that up, structured that in a way that worked well with the SBA, and then started looking for second shop to buy to continue to grow the platform. And so was able to actually do those two things pretty quickly. I bought my father's shop in April of 2025 and closed on the second shop in July of the same year. That was Don's Auto Center. The first one was Dale and Ron's. And so we've spent the past, a little over a year kind of nailing down our operational playbook and continuing to build out the pipeline and working on acquiring a couple more shops here in the not too distant future.
So what's it like putting the deal together for yourself versus, some of the larger scale deals you did at JP Morgan and then, Advantage, some of the different sizes? Like what's it like when it's your name going on everything?
It's really not that different. I mean, at least I silo it in my head to not think
Yeah.
about, the amount of money that I owe the bank. Then it's also you become desensitized to
Yep.
numbers when you're working on deals like at JP Morgan, and then even the deals at Vantage start to feel smaller, even though they are not small at all, to the point where now going out and spending $1 million or $2 million or $3 million on a set of shops and the real estate, it feels sizable if I stop and think about it from my piggy
Yeah.
bank, but it still feels very small in the world of deals that I'm used to working on. And so, other than that, the structuring, just figuring out the SBA and how all that works. And, we touched on Sam at the beginning of the show, but Sam has been great in terms of a resource to help understand all the ins and outs and nuances of the SBA and help those deals come together. But yeah, I mean, it really isn't that different, Nick. Unless if as long as I can remove my own emotions from it and forget about what I am signing to other bank personally,
Yeah.
a deal is a deal. We then just have to actually execute on the back end, which the operational piece is what had kind of been lacking from those prior two stops in my career.
So are you building out a playbook or have a, kind of your own method to the madness in terms of like, what your criteria is to acquire the next location or do a ground up or and then the due diligence and then get into close? Like are you kind of following the same process as you did before, or how has that shifted since you've taken over Gen Auto or got Gen Auto going?
Yeah, I'd say it's much less intense from a diligence
Mhm.
standpoint. And even then, I look for instance, shops that we're going to look to acquire now. It's do they have a good reputation? There's a lot of opportunities in these acquisitions. So I'd love to say, oh, I'm going to go acquire someone that already has hundreds of Google Business Profile reviews at 4.9 stars. But the reality is, like a lot of that online and digital footprint is opportunity for us. So it's much more, as we continue to operate in the space and get to know people that are parts suppliers or vendors of different, uniforms or other things that we use in our business, I can go out there and say, hey, who has a good shop that might be getting close to retirement, and use that to really kind of build the pipeline and find places that already have a good reputation. And then we do a little bit to vet that on the customer side. But then from a diligence perspective, it's does the business footprint work for us? Geographically, do we like where it's located? Because from a business operations standpoint, I have KPI benchmarks in mind now of, what the economics should be able to be per tech that we put into a place if we're running our playbook or by bay. And so I care about what the business has been doing in terms of sitting down to apply evaluation to it, because, we're not going to pay for the outcome that we're going to drive to. We're going to pay for the historical results. But in terms of like what I believe that that should be able to do once it comes into our platform under our operatorship, like, I don't need to do a lot of diligence to know that. So it's become much easier, and it's become a much more abbreviated diligence process than when, every industry was new and we didn't know the business at all, and it was new platforms at Vantage per se.
So, when you started out, and how long ago did you start Gen Auto?
Yeah, so that would have been very beginning of 2025. So we're, going on 20 months in it.
Yep. And so, did you already have a lot of the vendor relationships in place that you do now, or is that something you've had to build through time? Like you brought up, Google reviews, right? Like there's a vendor and a system for every part of a company, and it's pretty cumbersome and slow in the beginning for a lot of people. Where you just got to figure out, what do we need, what's our goal to grow to, who can do a good job for us, and then continually prove that where you have the trust to be able to move on. Did you already have a lot of those relationships in place that you can then springboard off of? Because once you have them, then you're adding locations. It's just fold them into the system, right?
Yeah. I would say no, we really didn't. My father's business that I acquired first had a number of the parts relationships, already had a Cintas account set up, all that good stuff. But in terms of actually like layering on some of those proactive professional services, no, that stuff did not exist. So it's been trial and error. We've tried different vendors, we've tried different setups, and some of those it's everybody wants you to sign a contract. So there's been places where we signed contracts and then broke the contract and had to pay to get out of it. And to me, that's kind of just the early cost of doing business. We could have moved much more slowly and maybe avoided some of those costs. But my opinion is it's worth, if we do get burned a little bit here or there on some of those breakages, it's more important for us to get the playbook in place quickly so that we then can really, dump the gas on the fire and grow, and feel good about the framework that we have in place for our playbook, Nick, than to take our time and slowly say, oh, well, that might cost us a couple grand here or there to get out of this.
It's tuition, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So when how have you grown as a business owner and developing your team and getting everybody aligned? So like when you took over, your dad's location, what was it like going from him to you, and then you, connecting with the team and starting to implement towards your vision?
Yeah. So I actually say going into my dad's shop and having, there's a lot of this is the way we've always done things. This is the way
Love
we
it.
should do them. And, a lot of the businesses in this industry are run by people who started as technicians and grew into
Yep.
shop managers or shop owners. And so there's a lot of the perspective of this is the way things have always been done. Running kind of that multi-unit playbook does require you to run lower margin than you could in certain areas if you were just trying to maximize the profitability of a single location. And so being willing to overinvest, I'd say overinvest. My father's perspective would be that we overspend on certain systems
Yeah.
versus the profitability that the one shop could be ran at. But those are the things that give us the visibility, that give us the structure to then take a step back and let that place operate on its own from a day-to-day basis. And so it's really been about figuring out how do we create a scalable structure and playbook, and then how do we put the right guardrails in place? How do we communicate the right guardrails to the manager that sits in the shop every day? Just it's been a tremendous learning experience. And we're working on building out an employee handbook and a set of SOPs. And I feel like every SOP, like there's a story behind it. And it cost me, a grand, 2 grand, 5 grand. And so that SOP book is going to be very valuable to me at some point. But, a lot of it though is that we don't know what we need to have in place until we run into some of these issues. And the alternative though, Nick, was to go like the franchise route. And I saw, plenty of franchise investments when I was at Vantage. And it would be nice out of the gate to have the franchise playbook and all their rules and all their processes, but the trade-off is that you're paying the royalties and the ad fund and all of that into perpetuity, and to build something that, lasts long term and we can continue to operate and grow, like, I just wasn't willing to sign up for that.
So yeah, a lot of the challenges in the beginning are like unconscious incompetence, right? Like I don't even know what questions to ask. I don't even know what I don't know. And then the conscious incompetence, right? Like I know we're not doing this right and we got to learn this. And then being able to master it to the next level. But it's kind of weird when you start into something, you're like, something's not right. I don't even know what the hell it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Something feels off, but I couldn't tell you what it is.
No clue. Absolutely not. And then it's this is it. We're definitely missing the mark here. So going from 1 to 2 locations, what 1 to 2, 2 to 5, then 5 to 10 are usually big jumps, right? What what was it like going from 1 to 2? But how did your operational playbook improve? And then, how you took over the company as the owner and kind of implemented yourself and your systems to get rolling.
Yeah, so 1 to 2, it's funny when you just have 1, you see how it operates, but I didn't have the perspective to say, different places operate differently in these ways. So getting the second shop and it running differently in a number of ways, like, okay, these 2 places run kind of differently, and then you start to run into the issues that that causes. You say, hey, we're all one company, a customer can come to one and they can come to the other, but then they do that and they're like, hey, well, like, why is this priced differently here? Or why is this experience different here? And you start to realize that I don't have a real playbook on a lot of these things. And we have to actually start to standardize on some of these aspects. And so realizing that there was differences in terms of operational nuances and that we had to start standardizing on things was a learning experience. And then trying to figure out, okay, what's what's going to be our standard? How are we going to do it? So that, yeah, that was eye opening. We're still working to really do that, nail down everything. And the strategy that we're pursuing, Nick, is also, I don't want to buy these places that have been around forever and make them all super cookie cutter post close. So they feel really corporate and they feel really stodgy. And like, I don't want to crush all of the life out of them in terms of what
Yeah.
makes them special. So they're constantly wrestling with like, what do we need to standardize versus what can we allow to be unique by location? And so it is it's an ongoing process. And so we're still getting that figured out. But a lot of it early on was just looking at those things versus trying to implement something that was, my playbook or my approach or something that I wanted. And only recently did I feel like I really put my finger on the scale and tip things towards the digital vehicle inspection, that, I'd been wanting to perform for a while, and brought in an external coach to help us learn and implement, and continue to reinforce that and standardize it. And again, you have your 2 shops that operate, like, are they doing things the same? Is it the same output? But that has tremendously increased our visibility and transparency to the customer in terms of what we're doing and what we're seeing and what we're recommending. And in an industry where there's kind of a natural inclination for people to think, they're trying to sell me stuff I don't need, that has been a huge win for us. It really changed kind of our relationship with our customers. And so that also then provides really clean documentation for both shops if they're then looking at a car that came from another shop to see what we did previously and what we found and what our concerns were. And so all of that continues to help unify the operations of the shop. But I would be lying to you if I told you that we have it nailed down and that both shops operate the same right now, Nick.
So and you're talking about the secret sauce that, makes them unique. What are some examples that, where you're trying to systemize, you know, some things that are going to be consistent on at both locations, and even as you grow, but what are some of the things that you give them the leeway to be unique in?
Yeah, just in terms of even just walking into the lobby at the front and how the place is set up and what's on the walls and who you see and who you talk to and how you interact with the staff and how they report to you what they found. I That's all part of the process and we're starting to standardize good chunks of that. But I also, again, part of buying these places is that you have this customer base that's really comfortable with the person at the front desk or the place and just the process. And so the more of that you start to change, the more people think, this isn't the place that I'm used to going. And you run the risk of running off some of those customers, which, these are not asset heavy businesses. The
Yeah.
vast majority of what we're paying for is the goodwill and the embedded employees and customer base. So I just, we have to be really mindful that we don't run that off and destroy
Yeah.
the value of everything that we've purchased in the transaction.
Oh, it's a delicate dance for sure. What does the future of Gen Auto look like?
Yeah, so we're gonna keep acquiring, keep growing. You know, Here in the next few months, I hope that we'll be in Kansas City. We'll have a couple more locations, and we'll continue to grow from there. I think across Kansas City, Lawrence, kind of the broader metro area, we can reach double-digit locations in the not too distant future. And then beyond that, it's, do we wanna take the leap and start looking at other metro areas? And so, I won't pretend to know the answer to that right now. We'll see where we're
Yeah.
at as we start to get closer to that. But as we continue to grow, it just provides more opportunities for the people that work for us in terms of training and advancement. It allows us to bring more specialized resources in house in terms of talent, but also equipment and assets. And so we can do a better job of serving our customers. And so there's just a lot of advantages as we scale that I look forward to being able to lean into and kind of make sure that we're providing an even better experience for our employees and our customers. And so if we can do that, it'll be a win. And we can certainly do that as we get, closer to double digit locations. And so again, we'll get there and then we'll see where we're at once we start to get a little closer to tapping out capacity wise in terms of what we can have in Kansas City Metro.
So what are some of the things you've learned about yourself, in getting to two locations and looking ahead and building the team and being able to standardize some parts of the business and help provide and continue to show personality in others that are unique. What have you learned about yourself the most throughout this?
I think as a leader, I'm very much someone that I don't go in and tell people how to do their jobs. I want to find good people and just empower them to excel in their role. And I feel very fortunate that I've got some awesome people on the team, and that has allowed us to find early success. And we'll continue to hopefully bring on really strong team members. And I tell myself, Nick, not being from the industry and knowing very little bit about cars, that it allows me to come at our offers from the perspective of our customers that know much less about cars than our team. And so, as long as we can continue to strike that balance where I make sure that we are distilling things down to a level that's digestible and helpful to our customers, and then bringing on good people and empowering them to really excel in their roles, then we're going to go a long ways. And I know that's not quite what you're asking about, what I've learned about myself, but what I've learned about myself is that, I got to turn off some of that type A. We don't need analysis on everything. We don't need perfect materials, but as long as I can make sure that I'm providing the right perspective to our team members, that we're analyzing the right things. And a lot of it's been figuring out what those right things are. But narrowing down that list, focus on the right things, empower the team, bring the right people on, then we're gonna go far. And so I've learned that I am much better working on the business than in the business. As someone that knows very little about cars, I think that I have a tendency to get in there and screw things up if I'm trying to get in the way of the daily operations. But that's the majority of it. Is I'm just thankful for the awesome employees that we have already and look forward to the team that we're able to build out in the future.
That's awesome. Well, Ricky, to wrap up, could you just tell our viewers about Gen Auto?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Generations Automotive or Gen Auto. It's www.genauto.com. We're in Lawrence right now. We'll be in Kansas City here in the not too distant future. And we're an independent auto repair platform. So anything mechanical, we don't do body work, but any of your maintenance needs, oil changes, tires, tire rotations to, larger mechanical jobs, engines or transmissions that need to be replaced, we can do any of that. So you can go to our website and book an appointment there or find our locations and give us a call, and we'd also be happy to chat with you, answer any questions, and get you set up with an appointment too. So if you have any auto needs, we're happy to help you out.
All right, Ricky, thank you. And final question, if you could offer up any advice to someone that's either about to acquire their first company, or a business that's already up and running and wants to acquire more locations or scale in different ways? What would that be?
Yeah, well, I'd say I feel fortunate that I landed down this path where I feel like my background is a good fit for how I can really create value as the operator of this business. It's having the deal background in a strategy where we're going to go out and be acquisitive allows me to lean into that strength. But I'd also say, as someone who went and made offers on some significantly more expensive businesses that fell through. When I say more expensive, I mean higher multiples. The value and the upside to buying something at a lower multiple gives you a lot of breathing room and wiggle room in terms of your debt service, and just having good credit coverage where you can make mistakes and not find yourself in a place where, how am I going to make this month's P&I payment to the bank? So buying at a lower multiple is a huge win, and I would highly suggest that for someone that doesn't have a lot of operator experience and doesn't want to really toe the line. Give yourself room to make a mistake by buying something at a lower multiple, and then really be reflective and think about what your personal strengths are, and try and buy something or pursue something that allows you to really lean into that.
Awesome, Ricky. Well, thank you for joining the Business Growth Journey podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nick. It's been a pleasure.